Hello and good morning. I am Andrew Plato, and this is Trust But Verify, a new approach to third-party risk management. And we are going to go ahead and get started now, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules and busy lives to attend our webinar this morning. This is a continuing webinar series that we do at Anitian to talk about all manner of subjects and issues that are relevant and important to the information security world. This webinar is being recorded, so if you zone out at some point, that's okay. We'll put a copy up on our website and on our YouTube channel. Also, if you have any questions during this webinar, feel free to use the question feature of GoToWebinar and ask them. And of course, also slides will be made available on our SlideShare afterwards. So let's go ahead and get started here. Today we are going to talk about third-party risk management. Now I will say that my original name of this was an old approach to third-party risk management, simply because we were using the word trust but verify. We'll talk about what that really means. So let me take a second and introduce myself. I think a lot of you already know who I am, but if you don't know who I am, my name is Andrew Plato. I am the CEO and president of Anitian. I am also a principal at Trubit Cyber Partners, which is an industry analyst company I'm a part of. I've been doing information security for a long time. I've done a lot of different things. I've done pen testing, I've done technology integrations, I've done risk assessments, I've written a lot of articles. Many of you know that I got into this industry after working at Microsoft in the mid-90s. And while I was working at Microsoft, I discovered, and I use that term somewhat loosely because I didn't really write about it, but I discovered SQL injection, or at least a very early version of it in '95, and it's what got me interested and excited in information security and what prompted me to start Anitian. I've been involved in making technologies and doing lots of different things in this space. Now let me take a second to introduce Anitian. Again, I think a lot of you already know who we are, but in case you don't, at Anitian we believe security is essential to growth, innovation, and prosperity. What we mean by that is that at Anitian we believe security is fundamental. It's fundamental to good business. If you look back in the history of mankind, humankind, security was essential to any civilization that to grow and prosper. You want to go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs approach, security is number 2 from the bottom after like food and water. So out of that belief in this essentialness of security, we are on a mission to build great security leaders. Our whole business is focused around helping all of you, people listening today, get better at your jobs. Do what you do right now and do it better. The way we execute that is through our 4 primary practice areas. Risk Now, which is our risk assessment approach, which would include third-party risk, I might add. We have a compliance practice we call Vision Path, focused on going beyond the checkbox, making compliance an everyday business practice. We have a comprehensive technical testing group, Ring Zero, which does pen testing, application security, configuration analysis. We do a lot of work with AWS and cloud hosting. And then we have an innovative managed threat intelligence product called Sherlock, where we can actually provide spot actionable intelligence on what's going on in your environment. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about third-party risk management. We're going to outline some of the problems with that, why it's such a challenge, what are some of the difficulties of it, and then I want to talk to you guys about a new approach using what frankly is a Cold War era concept. And we're going to outline how we're going to kind of take risk management and turn it into something and how you can approach it from a slightly different perspective. And we feel that perspective is more effective at ultimately managing risk. Now, a couple of key assumptions before we get into this presentation. This is, of course, like many of our presentations, a very large topic. I'm not going to be able to cover every dimension of it. At best, I'm going to kind of skim along the surface in some areas. My ultimate intent today really is to give you guys some good ideas, help you in doing what you're doing right now, and just do it better. We tend to be focused on sort of an IT-centric view of this, but quite frankly, these concepts do apply everywhere. We also make the assumption that trust is a more effective way of engaging with people. I'm a big believer in trust as a key component of building a business. When you come to work at Anitian, for example, you read a book. Everybody gets handed a book, Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey. We're big believers that trust is how you work with other people, and so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is not so much how can you manage risk better, but how can you manage trust better. Also, I think it's important to note that vendor management and third-party risk management are not entirely the same thing. They tend to get combined together, and they are very closely related. And frankly, you really can't do effective vendor management unless you're doing third-party risk management. But this is not a vendor management presentation. I'm not going to tell you how to better manage your vendors. Although many of the concepts we're going to talk about are relevant to that, that's not the focus. Our focus today is really on managing the risk management surrounding third-party providers and service providers. Okay? Now, last question I have for all of you, which is really, what is your intention sitting here today listening to my presentation? Are you looking to just be compliant? Is that kind of your mission as a security professional or a department? Or are you really looking to build a secure environment? If all you really want to be is compliant, which is a completely legitimate approach to information security, quite honestly, I can't help you. Anitian can't help you. We don't just make people compliant. That isn't our business model. There's lots of great, low-cost, totally useless checkbox auditors out there who will come in for a price. They'll check you off. They'll tell you you're good to go. Go find one, hire them. Good luck. That isn't us. We're in the security business. We want to make businesses secure and work better. And so that's what our presentation is about, is if you want to build a truly, genuinely secure environment, we can help you with that. An environment that incidentally will be compliant once you've done all the good security controls. Okay, so let's talk about this third-party challenge now. And typically these presentations, they always start with a bunch of, statistics and scary numbers and terrifying graphs, and invariably somebody does the whole, can you believe there's more computers on the internet? That kind of dumb stuff. I'm going to start with just really one scary number, and it's this big scary number, and I pulled this out of one of the data breach reports, probably Verizon, maybe it was a Ponemon study. 63% of breaches, and honestly I think this number may have gone up since I've did this slide, but 63% of breaches are caused by third parties. Now that's a pretty damning number. If you look at a lot of the breaches that have happened in the recent history, you can trace a lot of them back to a third party. Target is as good example as any. We tend to use Target a lot. Poor Target. The Target breach stemmed from a third party relationship, a HVAC vendor. A lot of these breaches are coming in off of third parties, and because of that, the management of third-party risk is that much important. And the challenge we have now is that third parties are kind of everywhere. You can't run a business today without having a myriad of third-party partners. I mean, and they're in places you never even really think of sometimes. Invariably, for a long time there, we'd meet with customers, and they'd always try and tell us how we're absolutely not in the cloud. We absolutely don't use third-party vendors. And you ask them, well, what do you use for email? Oh, Office 365. Well, that's kind of a third-party vendor. That's in the cloud. And so sometimes I don't think business leaders are entirely aware of where all their third parties are, and they're in places that like I said, the business isn't even aware of that. The real problem is that these third parties are kind of a lurking threat. You don't really even see the threat they pose. It isn't obvious. It's not in front of you on a day-to-day basis. I think the best example of this is one of the most popular software packages in the world, which is WordPress. WordPress is behind something on order of 75 to 80% of the websites out there. It's a great platform. I mean, I'm not slamming or saying WordPress is a bad thing. But WordPress, one of the value and one of the really cool things about it is you can download all these zillions of different plugins, and those plugins can do some really amazing things. Well, those plugins are third-party providers. I mean, they're a third-party vendor of sorts. So now the entire security of your website, which potentially could host all manner of secure data, could be dependent upon a plugin you downloaded that was coded by some random dude in, Romania. And this random dude in Romania isn't, he just coded it, to help out with, SEO optimization or something. Security wasn't really on his mind, probably at all. And so now the entire security of your entire site is now dependent on that dude. And therein lies the problem. You have this kind of lurking threat that's everywhere. The third-party components are in everything. And so it starts to become really a diverse problem, because you really, when you think about it, you kind of don't even know where all these third parties exist. I use the example of the WordPress guy in Romania. You're outsourcing components of your company, and you don't even realize you're outsourcing components of your company. There's entire vendors who they don't disclose to you that the people doing it are, in a different country or in somewhere else. It's not part of the disclosure process. You just kind of take them at their word that. So how do you know where all these people or these organizations are doing? Or how do you know where they got the code for all of this? Did they get the code from a legitimate source, legitimate development shop, or did it come from, again, some dude in Romania kind of thing? So we have this problem of not always knowing where things come from, and ultimately what happens is you kind of wind up with this guy, risk ignorance. You have leadership basically telling you, we got to do this. It's got to be done. We got to hire those guys. Got to get them on here. Get them on here. We got to have them. And they have no comprehension of the threats and the risk that they're facing. There's no insight into what is really going on here. And you're creating this massive dependency on all these third-party providers that are selected kind of at a whim, You're picking somebody and you're not really taking any time to really think about who and what they are. And so the traditional answer to this to date, to deal with this dependency and the fact that the business is really kind of pushing for these vendors, is to run around and send out a bunch of checklists. And the truth is that they don't work, because no vendor, and let's just be honest about this. If you ask a vendor, any vendor, I don't care how big or small they are for that matter, if you ask them, are you secure? Do you protect your data? I can pretty much guarantee you they're not going to write back, oh, no, we don't care at all about security. It's irrelevant. Your stuff's totally, our people are absolutely incompetent. We hire people who, they can barely, sit at their desk for more than, in fact, we're all drunk right now. Nobody's going to say that. But the truth is that, well, there's plenty of those vendors out there that really don't know what they're doing, and they may very well be drunk at the moment you're going to hire them. This checkbox process, it's a complete and total and abject failure. It just is. It's not going to deliver any kind of insight, particularly if you're using this kind of yes/no process. And unfortunately, this is what majority of companies do. Now, the reality is that we're talking about the threats and the dangers these third parties provide, but the relationships between organizations are very valuable. Outsourcing to third parties is a valuable part of building a business, and you cannot build a business in today's world without using third parties, without relying on partners. And so it's naive to think that you can just do it all yourself. You can't. You need these partners. You need to leverage off of them. That's why business leaders are so insistent on forging these relationships, because they're so invaluable to the business. And the reality is that when you can trust these partners, When you can trust your vendors, your business will work. I mean, this is how great businesses are built. They're built upon interlocking, trusting relationships where each party holds up their end of a commitment, and that's how you create great organizations. I mean, that's the genesis of a lot of great businesses and a lot of great organizations. So we have to kind of accept that relationships based on trust are fundamentally more profitable, they're more secure, they're more reliable. But I would also say the reverse of that. Relationships that are based on suspicion and compliance are pretty much doomed to fail, because you have to remember, every relationship you have with a third-party vendor is usually not about compliance. I mean, if you have a relationship with Anitian, it might be about compliance, because we may do compliance work for you. But the majority of your relationships have absolutely nothing to do with compliance. You think about like a recruiter or a staffing company, or even a cloud security provider for that matter, to some level. These are not compliance-centric relationships. And if that's all you look at them as, is you must comply with this, 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 and this, that's a relationship fundamentally based on suspicion. So, based on that, we have a fundamental challenge here of how do we trust our vendors better? Not how do we manage risk necessarily. How do we trust them? How do we verify that trust honestly? How do we know that when they say something to us, we can trust that they mean that? And how do we manage that complexity? Well, the answer lies in the good old 1980s, when at least some of us came of age, in a very simple principle of trust but verify. It was a principle they used in the Cold War, and it brought down the Soviet Union, so it's got to work, right? It's a simple principle, and it's a principle we can apply to third-party risk management. Let's start by trusting our vendors, and then work on how can we verify them, rather than just immediately assuming that every vendor we have is out to get us. The fact is that relationships based on trust they're just better. They incentivize honesty, because you're basically going to people and saying, look, I trust you. I know we all want to do the right thing here. Let's just get on the same page as to how to do this. I believe relationships with people, relationships with employees, relationships with your family, relationships with anybody are better when they're based upon trust. You start by trusting people rather than mistrusting them. Mistrust, it incentivizes lying. It builds an environment where lying is really the only way you're ever going to get a relationship to work. And unfortunately, when we look around at Anitian and we do this work for clients, we see a lot of lying. And that just isn't working. So what does this process look like? Well, it's actually pretty simple. It was so simple that I really struggled to make this graphic more interesting. This is really not that interesting of a graphic. But I did my best. There's colors and lines. It's not bad, right? Anyways, it really is very simple. We got inventory, and we're going to talk a lot about inventory because that's important. We got to trust. We have to have a process to just come right out and trust people. We have to have a process to verify that trust, and then we kind of have to manage all of that. And you notice both trust and verify go to the same place. How to manage that risk or kind of make those decisions. So we're going to talk a little more about that. So let's dive into what inventory is. Ultimately, what you've got to do here is inventorying is figuring out all the third-party vendors you have. And this list can be copious, to say the least. First off, you have vendors, like I said, in nooks and crannies in your company that you never even considered. First off, you've got plenty of just straight-up services. You got developers, you got resellers, managed services, contractors, consultants, financial services, HR, legal, accounting, marketing. You got all kind of the classic professional services that you engage with. Okay, each one of those is a third party, right? Then you've got the ones that are a little more difficult to trace down. You've got all those cloud providers, right? You've got the SaaS, the infrastructure as a service. You've got storage providers. You've got a huge list in that. And that's only growing. For many of you, you probably have dozens, if not many dozens, maybe upwards of 100 different cloud providers in your organization. You've got traditional software, hardware, you've got development components. Now that's the killer. Tracing down all those zillions of development components, that's almost a full-time job in and of itself at some places. Because your development group can grab components here, there, and everywhere. And anybody who's been in development for any length of time knows how that works. Of course, you have business partners, you have facilities. This list can just keep going and going and going. You've got to try and get your hand around that. The simple way to do that is to start thinking in terms of categories. What are the general categories of vendors? And this is kind of our suggestion, software, hardware, services, vendors, facilities. You might want to add cloud on there, might be another category. So start with those categories and start kind of dumping them into them. Now, many of you may say, well, I already have this. Great. That's wonderful that you have this inventory. You should. Most businesses should have a good inventory of all their vendors. But there's some key questions we need answers to when we start inventory. The first one is we got to know kind of who owns that relationship. So who owns the vendor? Who uses them in the organization? You always have an owner. There's always at least a group, a person, a team, somebody who owns them. And then there's people who use that vendor, and that might not be the same group. And then somebody who manages that relationship, which again, may all be the same person, but if you're in a large organization, of course, that could be even another third group. But the bigger question you have to answer is, why are you working them? What's the nature of that relationship? How did you get to this relationship? Now, this is where a lot of us make the first big critical error in third-party risk management. To get the answers to these questions, what do? We send out a spreadsheet. That doesn't work. You have got to go talk to people. You've got to get out in the organization. You've got to start having conversations with people. And here's why. This doesn't work. Spreadsheets don't work. And the simple reason being is exactly what I described before. People are just not going to fill them out. And I know invariably somebody says, well, they have to. It's part of their job. They're required to. They're not going to. Okay? I mean, seriously, they're just going to ignore it. They're going to push it off. And by the time they finally do it, they're just going to shove whatever data on there to make you shut up and go away because it's a pain. That's not the answer. You really want to get to the heart of matters in your company. You got to go out and start having conversations with people. You got to start getting them talking about those relationships, explaining to them why you have them, because you're going to be able to capture a lot of valuable intelligence about that vendor. Now, in some cases, it's straightforward. We have Office 365 because they're big and they're easy to use, and we're an office environment. Okay, well, that answer is pretty straightforward. We're using this oddball WordPress component because I have no idea. We just picked it. Who picked it? Why did they pick it? What's the reasoning behind it? We don't know. Okay, well, there's an interesting piece of intelligence right there. So when you're talking about inventory, there's a lot of different questions you can ask, but there's a couple of really key questions. Number one, how important is this relationship, is this vendor to the business, its mission, its goals, and what we're trying to do? This is a critical question to get answered because everybody, of course, thinks their vendor is the most important ever. You have to kind of weigh that up, and that's where talking to people will help you start to make some judgment calls on that. How important is that relationship? How can they hurt you? How could that vendor potentially damage you? Now, you could go off on a million different answers there, and there's probably lots of ways, but realistically, how could they cause damage? What sort of threats does that vendor pose to you as an organization? How much leverage do you have with them? Could you get them to do anything? What access do they need? Not the access they want, the access they need to do their job. And there's a very important difference. It's one, you talk to a lot of vendors, they'll go, well, you have to give us admin access on every computer in your environment. That will not be happening. Why don't you tell us what access you need in our environment, not the one that the doofus over here told you everybody has to get. What are you planning to share with them? What exactly? Are you sharing data, docs? What is the interaction between them? What service level agreements do you have with them? What are they? How did you pick this vendor? How did it come through to you? All of this is intelligence you're gathering about that vendor so that you can create kind of a matrix of each one of them. You can inventory them much in the same way you would inventory assets within your environment. Who are they? What do they do? Who owns it? What's the technical owner? You can add to this as you see fit. This is just kind of our recommendation. But the idea is that you want to capture a matrix of all the vendors you have. You want to get them categorized. You want to get them organized. You want to get some basic intelligence about each of these vendors down so that you can start the next phase of this process, which is you're going to trust them. You're going to issue sort of trust. And what does that trust mean? Well, we have a structured way of kind of answering or dealing with trust. And this is the approach. This is where Anitian's approach kind of comes into this. The typical strategy at this point is to establish all these risk rankings and rules and classifications. What we want to do at Anitian is kind of flip this conversation around. We want to say, rather than ask what threat they pose to the business, which is an important question, you still do need to ask that question. We're not saying don't ask it. What we're saying is what level of trust is reasonable for them based on our knowledge of the threats they pose and other things. And so we can create a very simple or simplified trust levels. And trust levels are, and I'll show you how those plot out here in another slide or so, but trust levels really are plotting two fundamental dimensions of third-party trust. The first is that big question, how important is the vendor to the business? How important to the success of the company, to your mission, to what you're trying to do, is this vendor? And that's a tough question to answer, but you've got to find an answer to it. And then the other big one, which I alluded to earlier, is how much access do they need? Not how much do they want, how much do they need? What that ultimately looks like is kind of like this. You wind up with a pretty straightforward plot. XY kind of plot. And you can very quickly and very easily kind of categorize those. If somebody has high access and high importance, you can call them a strategic partner. If they have high access but low importance, then maybe they're more of just a regular old partner. So what we've done is we've kind of named these trust levels. This allows you a real simplified, quick way to just shove vendors into various categories. Now this is important, and the reason we want to do this, and we want to create something like this is our recommended approach. Maybe you have a different approach. We've heard some companies like to, they create like the gold, silver, bronze level, or the 1, 2, 3, or the green, blue, red, or the I don't know, the dragon, troll, whatever. It doesn't really matter what you call these levels. The point is that you want to create kind of these buckets. These buckets are important because once you create these buckets, once you create this structure, you now have a language, a framework in which to manipulate and work within third-party risk management and trust management. These frameworks are important because they give you a tool to communicate, a tool to organize, a tool to interact with the business. You're creating something that allows you to then establish and do things, and do them in a structured, organized, categorical way, rather than in some willy-nilly, ad hoc sort of flutterby sort of way. And this is very simple. It's something that you put a graph like this in front of a CEO, they could get it pretty quickly. I look at this as a CEO and I go, okay, I kind of get it. We've got important people and not so important, and some people have more access than others. It's pretty straightforward. And if it isn't straightforward, then maybe you need a new CEO. Not a bad thing. Sometimes they need to be replaced. Not me, of course. Anyways, so these trust levels kind of allow you to answer that big question of, do you trust them? Do you trust this vendor? Is that level of trust commensurate with their relationship? Is there anything you can do about that trust? And I've talked about leverage, and I'm going to talk about leverage a little more as we get into this, but If you have no leverage over a vendor, then you kind of have to trust them. I've used the example of, if you're a small company and you use Office 365 from Microsoft, and you're a small company and you say, well, Microsoft, I need you to become, XYZ compliant. I mean, Microsoft's going to go, yeah, whatever, dude, bye. I mean, they're not going to listen to you. You're a small company. You have no leverage over Microsoft. They're huge. They're, zillions and billions of dollars, right? If you're a tiny little nobody company, you got no leverage. You're not going to get them to do anything special for you. But if you're the the federal government, for example, or maybe the U.S. Army or something, and you say to Microsoft, "Hey, Microsoft, we've got 175,000 accounts with you. We'd really like it if you'd do these risk things for us." Microsoft's going to be like, "Okay, yeah, sure, we'll get right on top of that for you." They're going to listen because you have leverage. So you have to kind of ask that question of, do you trust them? And yes, we trust them, so then we have to verify, yes, we need to verify that trust, that we need to do some sort of risk management activities, or no, we're just going to trust them, that's it, it's done, we have no leverage over them, fine, then we can move along. It's when we have to verify them, what are we going to do with that? And that's where we get to these risk management activities. Once we've decided that we can trust somebody, but we've got to verify that trust, we then wind up in this risk management process, which is, okay, how are we going to verify that trust? And these are some, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about these in a few slides, but these are some of the common risk management activities we can engage in. We can do tests, we can send out requests for information, on-site walkthroughs, we can make insured, contractual reviews. There's all sorts of these, and this list could probably go on and on and on and on. What we want to do is take those trust levels and map them to some key risk assessment activities. The idea here is that the more we trust a company, the more verifications we need. The higher that trust level is, the more verification has to be performed, because risk assessment activities are all about verifying that trust. So you can see we kind of laid out a classic structure here. If you're kind of an informal vendor, we're going to say, okay, we are just going to trust you. There's not going to be any activities performed on you and no verification, and we're just going to revalidate your trust level on an annual basis, because your relationship with us is not commensurate with any higher level of trust. And then likewise, as you go up that stack, right, as trusted partner, strategic partner, as you get to a point where a vendor has greater access or is more important to your business, then you're going to engage in some of these various risk assessment activities. But of course, you say, well, wait a minute, I can't necessarily do all those. The flexibility of all this really winds in how you plot your vendors. It has to do with where you're going to put them on that plot. And if you don't have leverage with certain vendors, if they don't have the kind of access, then you got to kind of move them around on that plot to get them where they make sense. This gives you, a risk assessor, the ability to kind of move those vendors around in the trusting process. But more importantly, it also is giving you that tool to communicate with leadership, with business process owners, with other people in the organization, a structure in which you can categorize the levels of trust. Now, with all that in mind, and that principle, let's talk about how we actually now verify that trust. And this gets us to kind of that next step. Once you've determined how much you're going to trust a vendor, or class of vendors, group of vendors, or whatever, then you're going to go through and assess that risk. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. What you're really searching for, the key question you ultimately want to answer here is that, are they meeting their risk management commitments? Do you have some form of a commitment with them, and are they meeting them? So there's a lot of different ways to answer this, and we showed a couple of those already, but I want to run through and kind of rank these. So the first, and arguably the worst way that you can manage and assess risk, is to implement some ludicrous eye candy, ridiculous dashboard with blinkety beepity boom boom bing boop 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 beep beep boop, bleepy lights and flashing thingies and circles and graphs and numbers moving all over the place, and where everybody can stand around and go, yes, look at our massive dashboard. Isn't it cool? Now, if you've listened to any of my presentations before, you know I really don't like dashboards. And I don't like them because they're so deceptive. And they're just so manipulative in what they do to you. And I just grabbed this dashboard. This is just some image I grabbed off the internet. The problem with these dashboards is that we pick them because they look good. We don't pick them because they do anything for us. There's nothing here. This doesn't really tell you anything. It gets too easy to ignore it. It feels like you're doing something here. This creates the illusion of risk management without the reality. And you could say, well, but there are real numbers going on behind the scenes here. Peachy. But you're not getting to the core questions and the core answers you need. You're just throwing data up there. Where did this data come from? Why is it meaningful? How does it... And don't get me wrong, I get it. Dashboards have their place. And I don't want to sound too ultra dismissive of them, but I am pretty dismissive of them. Just don't waste your money on this kind of stuff, certainly not initially. Okay, so let's move on. The next worst source of information is questionnaires and requests for information. Now, I know the first thought, and at least some of your head, whoa, wait a minute, we're a big organization. There's no way I could go around and talk to every vendor we have. That would take me half my life. I get it. I respect that. No problem. Questionnaires are fine. You can use them. I'm just saying we need to be honest about it. These are a pretty bad source of information because, again, people lie. I'm sorry. They just do. They're not going to tell you they're incompetent. And would you even know if they're lying? Here's the trick to RFIs and questionnaires. Never, ever, ever ask a yes-no question. Ever. Yes-no questions or compliant, non-compliant, that is just a killer. Those are useless because I've literally watched people sit there and go, and just check yes, 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 yes. Not even pay attention to the questions. And let's face it, I'll bet we've all done that. I mean, it's just human nature. You got to ask questions with open-ended answers. You know, and I used a couple of just basic examples here. Describe the methods used to encrypt sensitive data. Okay? That's not a yes-no question. How do you enforce least privilege access rights on users? How do you conduct that? How? What? Describe, define, list, explain. Use those words that require somebody to give a long-winded answer potentially, or at least more to it. Now you're going to say, that's going to frustrate my vendors. Understandably, it might. But the purpose is that you need to get some valuable intelligence. You're on an intelligence gathering mission here, and a yes-no question isn't going to answer that for you. So if you've got your questionnaires, what's the next process? Well, the next better thing you could do is get contractual assurance. That is, building language into your agreements with third parties that specify required risk reduction strategies, practices, or assurances. Things like service level agreements, termination clauses, breach notification, named insurance is a good one, compliance requirements. If you need a vendor to become PCI compliant, put it in your agreement with them. You must be PCI compliant. You need to show us proof of that within 12 months of contract sign. Indemnification clauses, business associates agreements. These are all great things to have, but they're not the best because, number one, are you really going to be able to enforce them? A lot of people have this mindset of like, well, it's in a contract. It's immutable. I have news for you. Contracts are really not, they're just pieces of paper. People can just ignore them. And the question becomes, can you really enforce the terms of that agreement? A lot of contracts are written, but they're not really enforceable. Or the enforcement activities necessary are just too onerous on everybody. So just because you have them doesn't mean you're actually going to get that. More importantly, are they reasonable? If you go around and say, well, all of our vendors have to be PCI compliant, we will not work with vendors that aren't PCI compliant, I can tell you right now you're going to exclude a lot of smaller and nimble vendors that just can't do that right now. You know, you could say, well, all of our vendors have to provide us, you know, this lengthy list of certifications. Well, you're just not going to get that from a lot of places. And so at that point, it kind of becomes, it's not reasonable. Okay, so what's the next step up? After contractual assurance, you want to move to internal validations. This is where you get a little more technical. You're validating that relationship at an internal level. So the best one you can do here is access reviews. What's an access review? Analysis of the level of access the vendor has to your organization. Now, in some cases, that'll be very easy. If you're talking about some development component, they have very little access, or do they? If they're a piece of software running on a website, then the website manages all of your privately, you know, protected data. Well, then that vendor has an incredible amount of access, way more than you realize, probably. So this is the kind of good thing you can do: is what's the level of access they have, and how does that match up to what they need? Look at firewalls, VPN accounts, Active Directory, internal segmented backhaul channels, encryption. Long list of things you can look at there. Conducting internal scans, vuln scans, configuration scans, compliance scans, all sorts of stuff. And spot checking what's getting shared with that vendor. Spot checks are a great way to double check, to do that verification. What are we sharing? Where's that data stored? Is it encrypted? Looking at the encrypt, you know, if you have a bunch of files that are shared, are they encrypted when they go out? You don't need to look at all of them, just look at a few. Spot check a few of them. So this is good because now you're actually getting some raw data. You're getting things that are independently valid. But the best is ultimately an outsider doing some form of independent testing and certification. Now, I'll admit I have a little bit of course, a profit motive in this. Of course, when I say this is of course in my best interest. So let's just admit that, get it out there. We've all acknowledged it. Let's move on. But the truth is that a disinterested third party is going to be able to render a much more objective opinion. Certifications like ISO and SOC and PCI are great. Third-party assessments, penetration tests, all those are good. What you have to ask yourself is that an honest assessment? Are they current? And do you trust the auditor? Unfortunately, we live in a world where there are a lot of those checkbox auditors out there, and they will issue PCI and HIPAA and ISO and SOC 2 and certifications for just a price. You pay them, they'll bring in some, you know, goober they found somewhere, and he'll check things off, and you're good to go. And I'm sorry that happens in the world, but it does. It's out there. And so you have to ask yourself, do you really trust that vendor? Do you really trust the data you're looking at? And there's some ways you can evaluate that. We'll talk about that. What we're really talking about here is, again, your tolerances. Can you trust them? Does the level of risk match the level of trust? How much leverage do you have against them? Does all that kind of line up? And does the person you're working with, whether that's the vendor or the person inside your own company, do they really get all this? The simplest way to do this is to create some form of documentation, some sort of quick way to document your tolerances. Don't document all the infinitesimal threats out there, because that becomes overwhelming. And to be honest, nobody's going to read that. Okay, you produce some big, huge risk matrix, and you throw that in front of, you know, your development manager. His eyes are going to roll back in his head, and he's going to be like, dude, this is like giving me like, oh, you're really harsh in my mellow, man, with all the check boxes, there's like colors and stuff, man. And so you can't do that. You got to figure out some way to really, really super, ultra, mega hyper simplify it. And this is a good example of that. I'm a big fan of the whole table thing because I think you can just get data out there in a nice, structured, clean format. There's a lot of ways to do this. This is the way we recommend, is kind of document the various kind of dimensions of risk, you know, compliance, reputational, financial. Establish a very simplified ranking. There's some description, what sort of tolerances you're going to have and what sort of remedies you're going to have. So that kind of gets you into this managing process. If you feel you need to go another level deeper and you do need to create these risk briefings, again, I would keep these super brief and super simple. This is kind of an example I would give to brief a business process owner, a single page of who the vendor is, relationships, some basic data, keeping this down to like 1 page of information. Remember, the key question you're asking here is, do we trust this vendor? Does everything line up? Does it make sense? Does the level of access, does the level of importance, do they all have alignment here? And you might say to yourself, well, who's going to answer that question? The business is going to answer that question. The business process owner is going to answer that. The CEO, the CFO. I know a lot of you may be in a risk management or internal audit role. You've got to remember, it isn't your job to answer whether you should tolerate a third party or not. That's often somebody else's job. Your job is to put the data into a format that other people can use to render a valid decision. And it's perfectly okay to accept risk. Let's talk for a second about the kind of the qualities of business trust. Whoa, my PowerPoint just went bad. I guess I shouldn't have trusted Microsoft. I said that nasty stuff about Microsoft, and my PowerPoint went bad. Hang on just a second. Let me restart it here. Shouldn't have said that. Let me get back to my slide. They're watching at me. I guess I shouldn't have done that pen test there. All right, here we go. Let's get down to the qualities of business trust. These are really not that much different for individuals or people or family members or businesses. Does the relationship you have with this vendor, is it authentic, consistent, transparent, respectable, dependable, honest, and sure? I can tell you as a business owner, as somebody who's been a CEO now for going on 20 plus years, that it actually took me a long time to learn these principles. And once I learned them and started really applying them, it made our business better. It made the relationships we have with other organizations a lot better. It really improved the relationship we have with everybody, including even our own clients. These are important principles, and unfortunately a lot of the internationally accepted frameworks of controls and a lot of this kind of risk management nonsense that's out there, and I don't mean to sound overly dismissive, but a lot of it is just nonsense. It's a lot of formality, and it forgets these very basic, very simple principles. I will say one thing about working with other vendors is this notion of respect. Do you respect them, and do they respect you? I'll be honest with you, I don't work with people who are disrespectful to our business. And I don't believe you should work with people who are disrespectful. We're all in this. We're all, your third-party management, risk management has got to remember that principle of respect and dependability and honesty. These are not words that are, well, they are words that go on those, those successory sort of posters. But the reason they put them on those posters is, well, they put them on those posters to make money. But the reason they're there and the reason we put them on the wall is because they're good things to remember. And if your management practices, if your risk management approach has gotten away from some of these good principles, then it just isn't going to fulfill the business needs. And I would really tell you to all focus on that respect. Transparency, I also think, is important. I would much rather work with a vendor who says, look, I know we don't have it right yet, but I'll make an assurance to you that I will get there within 3 to 6 months or a year. That's a vendor I will work with because they're being transparent, they're being open, they're being honest, being respectful. Versus well, I know better than you. I'm just smarter than you. I know everything. And how dare you even think to ask me that question? You're offensive to me and my awesomely greatness. How dare you even think about that? I don't want to work with those people. And you shouldn't either. It's important that these principles be in there because ultimately you're kind of looking for a balance here. You need to balance these principles of the value and the trust and the impact and the sensitivity. This is a balancing act between all those. And so what are you going to do to reduce risk? I showed you a lot of those things. You can require more certifications, independent testing. You can do more assurance, more insurance. You can reduce their access. That's the simplest one. If you've got a vendor that has way too much access, you need to bring that back. Remember, it's what access they need, not what they want. Okay? Last couple of thoughts here, and then I see we've got a great question. I'm going to take that. Do I need to buy a GRC platform? Invariably, any discussion about third-party risk invariably comes up with, well, should I get an Archer or a LockPath? Look, those platforms are great, and they can provide a lot of value, but it's important to remember they'll help you with data and workflow management. They're not going to help you actually build a program. Okay? Honestly, I think you should start by just build the program. Put together your spreadsheets and your matrices and your emails and all that stuff first. Get your structures in place. Once you have that, then find a tool that will fulfill that. These GRC tools, honestly, I'll be perfectly frank with you. I find them sometimes more difficult to work with than to just do it on a Word doc. Maybe that's a little bit of a Luddite approach for me, but they're just really time-consuming to set up. If you're a smaller or more mid-sized company, I don't know if I would encourage you to go that route quite yet. You're a larger company and you need really a more formal sort of workflows. These tools can be very valuable for that, but you're going to pay the price of setting those up because they're very time-consuming. It's important to remember a lot of these GRC tools, they rely on questionnaires as their sole input of information. And questionnaires are one of your least trustworthy sources of information after, of course, the dashboard that they provide you. Okay, last couple of ideas, and then I'm going to take that question. I just want to kind of get to a couple of key points here, which is this is a very big challenge. It's huge. It sounds just out of control, but the truth is you do this every single day of your life. All of us are constantly evaluating the trust we have with all manner of people. If you sit down at a restaurant and the server comes up to you and asks you for your social security number, you're not going to give it to them because you don't have a real strong trust relationship with a server at a restaurant. But if you go to the bank and you want to get a car loan for that great new Kia you're looking at, or Hyundai, and the bank guy, the teller, the loan processor asks you for your social security number, you're probably going to give it to him because there's an inherently a higher degree of trust going on there. We do this every day. You're doing this constantly. Now, should you give them your social security number? That's a different question. But you got to take that normal human process and turn it into something that's repeatable. Trusting is a good thing. It is good to trust. You should trust. It's also important to remember that business leaders, and I can say this as a business leader, we have significantly higher tolerances of risk than the regular, everybody else. And that's because you can't build a business, you can't grow forward, you cannot get out and do innovative new things unless you're willing to accept a certain amount of risk. Accepting risk is good. It is normal. It is part of growing a business. You are not going to make every vendor you have align with all your perfectly processes. It just isn't going to happen. If you do make recommendations to vendors or leaders, particularly the leaders in your organizations, you need to be decisive and clear in what you're recommending. No wishy-washiness. No, well, it could be this and it might be that. Wishy-washiness is, unfortunately, the curse of being intelligent. Intelligent people inherently always can weigh up multiple things. But the problem with wishy-washiness is it sounds like you don't know what you're talking about. You sound stupid to other people. And so it's better to be wrong and strong than right and all over the map. Okay, so there's my contact information. We do have a question, and I want to get to this question. So this comes in from Luca. What if 2 or more vendors are collaborating on the same activity we have? Looks like the trust is managed, considered a single vendor at a time independently from the other. I mean, one vendor can bring a lot of value when combined with the services provided with another when working together, and this can change the trust level we have. That is an extremely good point. Thank you for making that. And I'll admit my material probably did not address the kind of collaborative vendor approach here. The principles, though, do somewhat still apply. I would not encourage you to break those vendors apart. I would encourage you to kind of keep them together as a unit as best you can, because presumably if you have a big vendor and a small vendor collaborating together to work together, they're going to have very similar levels of access and very similar levels of importance. I would also note that when you're thinking about trust, it's also the kind of the highest level of trust that you have with them at any given point. So to use our example we just had, if you've got the big vendor and the little vendor, if they're going to inherit the level of access and the importance to the business of the big vendor, then essentially they're in the same category at that point. It doesn't matter that on their own they may have very little access or very little importance to you or no importance to you. Together, though, they suddenly are going to rise up to the level of their highest level of trust. And that does sometimes pose a challenge, because you could have a lot of vendors which seemingly are irrelevant to you, but the minute they start engaging with another vendor you have, they rise up. But this is a good piece of intelligence for you to understand and for you to communicate to leadership, because if you can explain this to leadership and you can frame it in that terminology, you're putting them in a better position to make a decision whether they want to work with either vendor. It also helps you understand the risks you pose in a given collaborative effort. If you're working with the big vendor and they're working with some little vendor, and you know that little vendor isn't going to have SOC compliance and PCI, or they don't encrypt, or they're in another country that does not have the same rules and laws that we do, then you're either going to have to put the onus of assurance on the big vendor, you're going to have to subcon them, you're going to have to put them through contractual assurances, you're going to have to reduce that level of access. Now you're having a real conversation. And you can have that conversation with leadership because you've highlighted that issue. So that would be my answer. That was a great, excellent question. Okay, so we've reached the end. I don't have any other questions, so I'm going to say thank you. Thank you, all of you, for listening today. I hope it was fun. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got some good ideas. If you have any additional questions, comments, concerns, questions, you didn't like my joke about Kias, if you're mad at Microsoft for my PowerPoint crashing in the middle of this, go ahead and send me an email. You're welcome to tweet. There's our web. We're going to put these slides up on our slide share. There's a link to it. You can go hit that. All of you who attended will get an email from us with a link to the recording and a link to the slides. And again, thank you very much. I deeply appreciate all of you spending the time with us today. Have a great Wednesday? It's Wednesday. I don't even know what day it is. Have a great Wednesday. Have a great rest of the week.